This is why relationships get boring and why porn doesn't get boring. Because as you pointed out, porn is the ultimate driving machine because it's like, oh, you don't like this? How about 2? How about 3? How about this? How about this set? On and on and on it goes. Infinite variety. So it's such a sticky, difficult problem to deal with. We have to stop for a moment and make a conscious choice to enjoy what we are in the moment. What we have is the here and now. And that's the real key to getting away from the pushing of dopamine, including online pornography. What real pleasure do we get from hoping that the next thing is going to be exciting? What real pleasure do we take? There are more, even spectacularly satisfying ways to spend our time if we can first break the porn addiction. If we can do that, there's a richer life to be led. And I believe the very first step is not beating yourself up, but it's to say that there is something better and it's worth my time.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Lipkowitz, and with over 12 years of meditation experience as a mindfulness trainer and coach for high performers, I've become obsessed with helping people break free from compulsive, unhealthy behaviors and addictions and step into a life of true freedom so that they can finally become their best selves and cultivate deeper and lasting fulfillment. I've created Unhooked, the Breaking Porn Addiction podcast, to give you simple, actionable, step-by-step strategies to master your mind and optimize your life. This is Unhooked. Hey friends, welcome back to Unhooked. I'm your host, Jeremy Lipkowitz. Today's episode is a deep dive into one of the most misunderstood drivers of addiction, dopamine. I'm joined today by Mike Long, an expert on dopamine and compulsive behavior, and co-author of the international bestseller, The Molecule of More. Trained as a physicist, Mike brings a rare blend of scientific insight and down-to-earth wisdom to this conversation. His work explores how dopamine fuels addictions like porn and serial dating, and more importantly, how we can break free. In this conversation, we unpack the difference between pleasure and happiness, why dopamine traps us in the endless pursuit of more, and why traditional willpower isn't enough to overcome it. Mike shares practical, step-by-step tools grounded in neuroscience and makes the case that if we truly want to heal, we don't just need better habits, we need a life filled with meaning. So if you're struggling with porn or social media or workaholism, or just feeling stuck in a cycle of craving and dissatisfaction, then this episode is for you. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Mike Long. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Unhooked podcast. I am your host, Jeremy Lipkowitz, joined today by a special guest and author, Mike Long. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for the listeners out there, Mike has been brave enough to join us at 3 a.m. his time to accommodate my time zone. So if he makes any mistakes, then you can blame it on the time zone. If he says anything wise, I'm sure you can attribute that to his wisdom.
Good prompting from you. That's what we'll attribute it to. Excellent prompting from the host.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to give the listeners just a little background. You wrote this book, you co-authored the book, The Molecule of More, talking about dopamine. And I'm just very curious, what inspired you to dive into this topic of dopamine? Was there a personal connection to it in any way?
Well, it's funny, Jeremy, and first, thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you who are listening in. I'm very grateful, or watching, I suppose, too, what we're doing here. The first book, Molecule of More, I hate to burst bubbles, but Molecule of More began as a passion project. Dr. Dan Lieberman and I have been friends for many, many years, and we're kind of nerds. And so we're not the kinds of guys who say, well, let's go shoot hoops or let's go to the ball game or whatever. We like talking about ideas, and we were fortunate enough to meet and discover this is what we had in common. we thought it'd be fun to write a book about something that ignited both our passions. Or both, as a psychiatrist, he's very interested in neuroscience. As a writer and as a physicist, I was interested in these systems as well. So it came about as looking for a way that we could do two things at once: amuse ourselves with something new and actually help people. And we looked into this matter of dopamine, which we felt from our own study and from some reading that we did was basically misunderstood by the world. Nothing less than misunderstood as being presented, as you know, and as your listeners know, as this molecule of happiness, this thing that, it's a dopamine hit and I feel so good. And that is in no way what dopamine does. And we thought, what if we could explain this? And what if we could make it compelling, even entertaining? And what if we could change the language that people use to better understand this? So it would no longer be known as the molecule of happiness, but the molecule of what it really is, the molecule of more. And that's what we set out to do. That's where the first book came from. We did change the language. The second book, as we'll talk about in our broadcast here, is about putting that knowledge to use so it really can make a difference in your life.
I think that's such an important topic because, as you say, there is even today, there's so much misunderstanding about dopamine, and so many people just equate it with the good feeling that you get when you acquire what you want, when in reality, it is, in fact, in some ways, almost the opposite. It's the craving, it's the desire, it's that feeling and anticipation just before. It's not the actual moment of enjoyment. There was this one, might have come from you or some of your work, but there's a kind of famous quote that, dopamine is not the molecule of enjoying, it's the molecule of wanting, and it's involved in the craving, actually. I'm curious to know, were there other misconceptions around dopamine that caused you to write that initial book?
I think once you understand that it, as you said, it's this wanting thing. I believe that's the first thing to understand, and there's so much to unpack there, Jeremy, as you know better than anyone else. I've talked on a lot of podcasts about this, but I think you and your audience know so much viscerally about the possibilities and the pain of this thing. But I believe the other thing to know, and this really goes to the heart of the new book, is that we can divide the entirety of the set of neurotransmitters in the brain into two categories. There's dopamine and there's everything else. And dopamine is the anticipatory neurotransmitter. Everything else is a consummatory, is a here and now feeling transmitter. And that's quite a revelation. In fact, let me just kind of iron that one more time. Dopamine is the only thing that lets us think about what is not and what might be. Dopamine deals exclusively in possibility, not in what is. All the others, vasopressin, norepinephrine, oxytocin, serotonin, these deal in what we have right now, something we experience through our five senses and appreciate the feeling of as it occurs. So that's the other big difference in dopamine. And that's why it's so hard to deal with. You've got literally dozens of others, depending on how you want to categorize them, dozens of others to deal with that are pushing us to appreciate or not appreciate what we're feeling, smelling, tasting, touching, hearing. And here's dopamine over here saying, ignore all that. Look what might be. There's the heart of addiction, the craving for that.
Yeah. And I love that your work, it gives language to what, as you mentioned, what I and so many of the listeners of this show know so viscerally, but to be able to put language to that experience. And what you said there is that anticipatory effect, the anticipation of some future reward is what addiction is. And, it's like when you're hooked on porn or any other substance, that dopamine comes not from the finding of the video that you want. It comes from the anticipation, that feeling of just around the corner. Oh, if I search this term, maybe I'll find something right around the corner. And that can keep you going forever because it's always, it gives you that sense of, I just want to look a little bit longer. Maybe there's something slightly better out there. It's that anticipation that's so strong.
That's exactly right. It's the anticipation that's there. And we find that it's the craving that drives it. One of the keys to understanding the mechanism of addiction is realizing this bifurcated element of it. There's you're talking about old sayings in the addiction community. It takes more and more to feel less and less over time. And by itself, that should take care of addiction, but it doesn't. If it took more and more to get less and less pleasure, you'd eventually go, to hell with this. I'm not trying that hard anymore. And that's the down regulation that happens. It keeps us that keeps us having to go more and more effort to get less and less until we kill ourselves in some cases but here's the other part, is that what the addiction process doesn't touch is the craving. That doesn't downregulate. The craving stays as hard as ever. And I find that so ironic and so informative at the same time. It's the craving that's the problem. And, if you're listening to this and you've dealt with addiction, you're thinking, well, of course it's craving that's the problem. But if you were to explain it to somebody and say, I don't even get any pleasure from this anymore, they'd say, well, why don't you stop? And that's a reasonable thing to say. If it doesn't feel good, why don't you stop? It's because you can't.
Yeah, that is so powerful and so insightful. And I wish everyone would just go back and replay that, because that gives so much insight into the life of the addict. It's that the pleasure from the substance or the behavior, it fades away and you no longer actually get pleasure out of it. But there's this sense, this feeling of, I just can't stop because I just want it. I just crave it, even though it doesn't bring me pleasure. And hopefully, for all the listeners, I know a lot of times we get listeners of partners of porn addicts and people who are struggling with loved ones. And hopefully that can give you some compassion for someone who's struggling, to know that they don't want to do it. They don't get any enjoyment out of it, but there's this strong fire of craving. And that's really what dopamine is.
Well, that's exactly right. And let me give one other thing, because I feel so strongly that if you're hurting and you begin to feel hopeless, or you've already been to that point where you go, I'm hopeless, there is help for you. There is a better way. And I want to point this out. If sometimes, tragically, people will get caught up in this discussion with professionals who will say, well, you can't really have a behavior and call it an addiction. You'll hear professionals say there's no such thing as a behavioral addiction. There are only compound addictions. By that I mean, a chemical compound. And the thing is, don't even engage that argument. It doesn't matter. The thing that I said about craving and pleasure, that's the truth of it. Now, if some specialist wants to or wants not to call that an addiction, let them. The problem remains real. So don't worry about when someone says, well, there's not really such a thing as behavioral addiction. Doesn't matter what you call it. The craving remains. The pleasure goes away. So you have something to deal with either way. And what we label it, let somebody else fight about that. We got life to live here.
Yeah. Fortunately, I would say that what I've seen over the past 10 years, and especially in the past 5 years or so, is fewer and fewer specialists are claiming that you can't be addicted to behavior. And more it's becoming widely accepted how obvious it is that, of course, you can become addicted to behavior in the same way you can get addicted to gambling, get addicted to shopping, you can get addicted to porn. It's the exact same neural pathways kind of on the underlying level in terms of the way it plays on dopamine and craving and all these ways. One thing that, I think it would be helpful to take a step back and just explore, what is dopamine? Like, what are these systems it's involved in? Because one of the misconceptions I see is people demonizing dopamine and saying, oh, dopamine is the problem, not realizing that dopamine is actually part of motivation. It's part of actually doing all the things we want to do. And so can you just explain what dopamine is and what it's involved in a basic level?
Well, maybe it's because we're talking late at night, but I'm going to leisurely make my way through this. So please rush me along if I get too long in the weeds, Jeremy. Dopamine is absolutely necessary to getting through every moment of life. And the example that I like to use is if we talk about dopamine as being the thing that drives us toward some possible pleasure by means of this chemical anticipation, we can talk about listening to music as a dopaminergic exercise. Why do we enjoy music? Well, this is largely theoretical, but it works in practice as we understand to gain understanding. There are notes that naturally follow one another in our brains, and we anticipate how good it's going to sound to reach that resolution. We know if we play the 1, the 4, and the 5 in the scale, we ache to go back to the tonic. We go, if you're a musical person, you know exactly what I'm talking about. 1, 4, and a 5, and then we want to go back to the 1. That's a dopaminergic exercise. We crave. We know that 1 is waiting for us to give us resolution. So even in moment to moment, there's a tiny little dopamine activity going on. So it's not as if we could say if we could get rid of dopamine, all our problems would be solved. We have so many more problems without dopamine because it carries us through the second to second, microsecond to microsecond of life. But let's really reel back the clock and talk about what dopamine is and why it exists in the first place. In early mankind, we needed an early warning system. Here we were, the caveman is stomping around, and the caveman was surrounded by possibilities and threats. So dopamine became a survival mechanism. In order to survive as the caveman or cavewoman, you had to have a couple of things. One, you had to have constant lookout for something that might be useful. Something that you might be able to eat, where it's to kill an animal or eat a berry you hadn't seen before, and it's also danger because it could be an animal you hadn't seen before or a berry that might hurt you. So dopamine is basically this system that monitors your senses for anything that is unfamiliar and possibly useful. Unfamiliar and possibly useful. So right now, if I ask the people who are listening, if I ask you, said, close your eyes and tell me about the room you're sitting in, you wouldn't do a very good job of describing it because you're not paying attention to it. Everything there is safe. It's normal. You're accustomed to it. There's nothing to be gained by knowing exactly the shade of white on the wall, exactly how many shelves are on the bookshelf in front of you. But dopamine is looking for anything that pops out. Somebody's face appears in a window, a noise comes out. If someone knocks at the door, if the phone rings, whenever something happens that is higher than normal intensity of interest, what we call more salient than something else, our systems kick in and say, hey, you better check that out. It might be useful. Isn't that what we just said about dopamine? Hey, look at that thing that we don't know anything about. It might be important. You better check it out. That's what dopamine does. And it was a survival system. And that system is called the desire system. We're going to call it the desire system. And so it kicks in, it causes us to pay attention. Now, the other part of the dopamine system is called the control system. And that's the system that allows us to play out in our minds without doing any physical work whatsoever to imagine what might happen in various scenarios. That's what allows us to think about, we can do anything from imagine what we might want for lunch. Will this make me happy? Will that taste good? Is it going to have to spend too much? Is this on sale? How far away will I have to drive? That's controlled dopamine exercising imagination. So you have to something thinking about abstract is, should I marry this person? How would I build a rocket to the moon? What if I make a change in this engine design? Will it be more efficient or less efficient? Can I think about mathematics, philosophy, etc.? That's all control dopamine. So here's this system that does nothing less but enable us to move into the future constructively and safely. Began as a survival system to alert us to what was possible and useful or dangerous. Then it spreads over to the other part of the dopamine system, control, that says, let's manipulate this in our brains without having to spend any physical energy and figure out what's going on. That's what dopamine does. It works great if you're a caveman, and it's worked great for centuries, eons, epochs even, until it didn't. because now we live in the modern age. I'm not just going to say the 21st century, but especially the 21st century, where we're surrounded by things all the time that leap out beyond the normal. They might be useful, they might not be useful, but they're almost never going to make our lives immediately fantastically better or kill us. That noise, that shape behind the mailbox is not a tiger. It's probably the mailman. And yet dopamine is boom, there it goes. And so dopamine is on a constant lookout for the possibility that something new. And for instance, when we talk about behavioral addiction, one of the things that's possibly exciting and possibly new that's right in the future is whatever's right below the bottom of the screen as we scroll down that phone. Dopamine kicks in and says, what if? It's happened before. It's been good down there before. Maybe it will be again.
Well, and it's, when we start to talk about technology, social media, porn, whatever it is, and we can start to recognize that these companies are engineering these things to directly tap into those systems, those evolutionary systems, in the way that when they introduce the red notification symbol and how that is something unusual, it grabs our attention. What is this red flashing symbol? And it gives us that little hit of anticipation. I wonder what it is. I wonder if I click on this, what's the email that I'm going to get? What's the message? Who's the person that left a comment? And it taps into that sense of anticipation of this could be useful. This could give me pleasure. This could solve some of my underlying needs or the problems that I have. And so these systems are just totally engineered to hijack our dopamine system.
Well, this reminds me of a point I've wanted to make so often, and this will be the first time I've gotten to make this with someone. I'm glad we're going to get to talk about it. Is for some of your listeners who are older, you may remember a time that on the backs of cars here in America, on the backs of cars, there was not a light in the center of the back window that came on when you tapped your brakes. There were only the brake lights below. 2 decades ago, maybe 25, maybe even 30 years ago, they added this third light that would come on. So now there were 3 lights in the back of the car, and that was to draw your attention. Oh, that's something new. That'll alert me to stop. It's not anything new anymore. It's nothing unusual. And so it doesn't have an effect. It doesn't matter anymore. It only lasted as long as it was abnormal. Now it's normal. Now it makes no difference. It's a perfect example of how chasing some dopaminergic promise leads you somewhere good for a while, and then it just becomes part of the wallpaper. Just another thing that's not special at all. And there's a little bit of, I don't want to say comfort, but I'm going to say there's a little bit of truth to hang on to, useful truth, in that the thing that dopamine's telling you to chase is not going to be useful or interesting for long in most cases.
Yeah. To push back against that, one of the reasons that porn is so damaging is that there is infinite variety on there. And so it is infinitely variable to the sense that it always feels like there's something just around the corner. Whereas I can imagine, brake lights or a bag of potato chips, at some point you get sick of the bag of potato chips. But with porn, there is this feeling of there will be something else, because there's an infinite amount on there. I mean, you wouldn't be able to go through it all. And it's one of the reasons that it's so damaging.
Well, you're exactly right, and thank you for pointing that out, because I don't offer it as a way to say, oh, well, eventually porn's going to get boring. I think we all know it's not going to get boring. It's just going to take more to get the same stimulation. And there is such a variety of human behavior. Let's talk about it in plain language. There is always something new to be found. There's always something new to be found. And then it's wrapped up in the power of the other neurotransmitters and to some extent cultural attraction. But the thing is, we're no longer just talking about an addiction to a compound or a simple behavior. We're talking about an ever-changing dopamine target that is almost like something out of a science fiction movie, Jeremy. As you well know, if the last monster or the last delightful target that you chased is suddenly not as exciting, have no fear. There's a new one coming along.
Right.
This is
And
why
this is where we see
something-
the escalation in porn addiction. People get into more and more extreme content.
Yes, yes, and a good demonstration of how this does have some biological underpinnings that are different for men and women, as we see about 28% of men report PPU, problematic pornography unit, where we see in some surveys, there are others, but in some surveys we see a number around only 3% for women. These things are caught up in who we are biologically. So we're up against a lot of pushback from the universe itself, which doesn't mean it can't be accommodated and trained and tamed, but it does mean this is not simply a matter of, oh, the culture did this to me, or, oh, my parents did this to me. No, evolution did this to you in some extent.
Right.
And it's our job to tame the world, and that means to tame ourselves sometimes. Not just with self-discipline, but with real planning.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into that topic of how do we tame the dopamine system, especially since that's the topic of your most recent book. But before we do that, just one thing that I think would be very valuable for the listeners and for myself as well is, as you've mentioned, dopamine it's just an inherent part of who we are, and we don't want to get rid of it. It's involved in all these beautiful processes as well. What are some of the signs that you have an unhealthy dopamine system, or kind of a dopamine system that has gotten out of whack? What are some of the things that you could look for?
Let's see. I'll talk about this from two angles. The first is I want to talk about what we're talking about when we talk about it. How about that? When we talk about the dopamine levels, there's really not a dopamine level to talk about, in the same way that we can say, well, what is your potassium level in your blood or something like that? This is not how that works. The dopamine that we're concerned with exists in only one place, and that is here. Right here. In fact, right here. That's the only place it is. Is there dopamine in your blood? Yes. Does it have other things besides behavioral effects? Yes. That's not the dopamine system that we're talking about. So we have dopamine levels as kind of a proxy for what we really mean, which is how much dopamine activity is going on in particular circuits inside the brain. Sometimes we're talking about within a single neuron, a single neuron. We've got the molecule that moves down this toward the synapse and jumps across. So to say I want to raise or lower my dopamine levels is a crude approximation of what's really going on. So I just want people to understand you can't drink a big glass of dopamine and hope to raise your levels. It couldn't even get in your brain. It wouldn't work that way. There are reasons that we could go into biologically that you can't push dopamine into your brain. That's why they give you things like L-Dopa, which are precursors to dopamine, get into the brain and hopefully become dopamine. To get to your question, which is what are some signs that you may be having this kind of dopamine problem? Well, there are things that are going to naturally feel problematic. If you find that the behavior that you're up against, and let's just talk about things like pornography and the attendant behaviors that accompany this kind of problem. If you find that you are going against the decisions that these acts make you make, cause you to go against your own moral structure, your own moral code. That's one thing. If you find you're having to lie about what you're doing, to do this, especially with a partner on a less specific scale. If you find that you are constantly getting bored with things faster than everybody else around you, that's a good sign of it. If you find that you're the classic person who, I love this example. Everybody knows the rich guy, or has heard of the rich guy who can afford a beach house, but is never out there to enjoy it. That's the classic dopamine paradox. If you're hardworking, clever enough, and rich enough to have figured out how to get a beach house, you'll probably not be able to slow down enough to enjoy the beach house. That's a mark of a very dopaminergic person. And that points us toward the real crux of my book. of my newest book, Taming the Molecule of More, is that we can chase individual dopamine problems like online pornography, like pornography in general, like gambling, like shopping, like serial dating. We can chase those things and we can begin to deal with them successfully even. But to have a life that gives us some satisfaction, we have to purposefully choose to create a balance between the anticipation that dopamine makes us chase and taking pleasure in the here and now. I'll give you an example. After Neil Armstrong went to the moon, he was interviewed later, and a reporter said, "What do you think about how it felt to go to the moon?" And he said, "It was something we did. Now we should do something else." Wow. That's a cold answer. A man asked him how it felt, and that's the word here, how it felt to be on the moon. And his answer was not about how it felt. It was about, as Bob Dylan put it, okay, what else can you show me?
Mm-hmm.
We have to stop for a moment and make a conscious choice to enjoy what we are in the moment. And to say, yes, there are things in the future and we should pursue them. But what we have now has to be enjoyed because this is really all we have. Think of the very few specific memories we have of moment to moment in life. It's not very much. Think of your childhood. Could you fill it with details for more than an hour or two of talking? Probably not specific details. You could talk about it in broad terms and make up a few things you think might have happened, but what really happened, you don't remember. What we have is the here and now. And that's the real key to getting away from the pushing of dopamine, including online pornography. What real pleasure do we get from hoping that the next thing is going to be exciting? What real pleasure do we take? And even though we're fighting a lot of natural urges, a lot of natural good feelings in that pursuit and in that capture of the moment, in the end, it's so ephemeral. What we want to find is a way to enjoy the here and now. And there are ways to do that. I talk about it in the book in terms of some things that Viktor Frankl said, the great psychiatrist Viktor Frankl said in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. I talk about what Aristotle said in terms of the virtues. I talk about the tragedy of the Great Gatsby, promising us that life has no point. In fact, there are more even spectacularly satisfying ways to spend our time if we can first break the porn addiction. If we can do that, there's a richer life to be led. And I believe the very first step is not beating yourself up, but it's to say that there is something better and it's worth my time.
Yeah. So much of that resonates with me. And especially, my own particular story of how I recognized that I was addicted to porn was very much around this topic of constantly pursuing things, constantly craving, running after things. And my whole life was lived out in that, just that life of constantly pursuing. And I never actually took the time to stop and smell the roses, to stop and enjoy the things that I did accomplish. It was never good enough. It was, okay, I've aced that test. What's next? I've, hooked up with this person. What's the next one? And to realize just how unfulfilling that is, how unsatisfying that is, that your whole life can just be lived in that state of emptiness and that state of searching for something more, but to realize that there is a deeper happiness to be found when you can actually enjoy what you have. And that real happiness isn't about getting something bigger or better or more. It's actually learning how to appreciate what's right in front of you. So I definitely resonate with that.
I'm so glad you do. And I want to stress, because it is so easy when you're in the grips of this stuff to say, he's talking way down the road. Right now, this is what I want, damn it. This is what I want. This is what I need. Who's it going to hurt? I want this now. What I'm saying, what you're saying from experience, God bless you, is not to dismiss any of that stuff. All I'm saying is give it some thought. And as much as, as much as I'm in the business of selling a book, if I don't sell another book, but I can help somebody with this, that's the real treat. And I'm
Yeah.
saying inside this book, it just says, hey, stop for a minute and ask, would you rather spend that time on something else? Of course you would. Of course you would. And if the answer is no, I wouldn't, then that's an answer in itself, because it says, why are we're headed for a huge, overwhelming question, Jeremy. And that is, why the hell are we here?
Mm-hmm.
And if we can recognize, maybe we can address that question and find some fullness and freedom in that, we'll have to begin by saying, what things can we do besides buck up and be strong? What can we do to get over the porn addiction? And the answer is not try a little harder. The answer is things like accountability partners. It's about identifying triggers. It's about the use of technology to cut ourselves off from these things. It's about openness with ourselves and with other people. It's about letting the chips fall where they may. It's about deciding that you're talking so casually about your history with this. I love what your show is about, because I can say what I'm going to say without having to hesitate. And this is a little difficult for some people to hear. But Howard Stern's sidekick, I can't think of her name now. Anyway, the great radio, the very popular Howard Stern, and she was sexually abused as a young woman, as a teenager, and she talks about it very openly on the show. And she says, "What do I have to be ashamed of? I didn't do this. He did." He did it to me. I'm not going to run and hide and protect him. He did it to me. I overcame it. I have something to brag about. And if you want to talk about it, we'll talk about it. I have an acquaintance, let's say, who spent many years cutting herself as a teenager. And now she goes out in public and the marks are all up and down her arms. And she says, people say, well, what is that? She goes, that's where I cut myself. You want to hear about it? She's not ashamed. When we can own ourselves, that's not saying own our behavior and be ashamed and be sorry for it. No, it's like, this happened to me. Why should would you apologize for having cancer? My God, you're dealing with something that's messing with your life in a way you don't want it to mess with your life anymore. If that bothers somebody, that's their problem, not yours.
Yeah. I think what this is bringing up, and I'm very glad you're talking about these more kind of wholesome, holistic approaches to living a good life, is that especially in the last few years, this topic of dopamine has become very popular, and you're seeing all these things that are more kind of not pharmaceutical approaches, but almost like mechanistic approaches to fixing your dopamine. It's, go take a cold shower and that'll fix your dopamine. Go do this and what you're talking about is, if you want to fix what's, kind of broken with your dopamine system, what's wrong with the dynamics of your dopamine, it's more about looking at the underlying life situation and how you're approaching life and what's out of alignment. Do you have a sense of meaning? Do you have a purpose? Are you aligned with your values? That,
yes.
I think for a lot of people, they miss the point and say, well, I got to fix my dopamine. Let me take a pill or, do something that's going to shock my system. What you're saying is fix your life, and the dopamine naturally starts to equilibrate a little bit better. Is that correct in saying
that's close? I'll say that is not just an acceptable, but that's a workable answer. I'll say this. I'll say the first thing to do is to get you to stop hurting. And so I think actually the first thing to do is, what can we do to get you out of this dopamine loop? What can we do to stop your pain, your embarrassment, your discomfort? And once we begin to apply those brakes, then we really need to apply the question you just talked about. So they're really simultaneously. I would hate to tell. So it's like, I don't think we say, and this is not what you're saying, but for the purposes of discussion, we don't want to say to somebody with a broken leg, well, we need to start some good therapy so that muscle gets stronger again. No, first thing you got to do is let that leg heal. Let that bone heal. And so when we're dealing with somebody who's dealing with online porn or whatever the addiction is, or the addictive behavior, addiction-like behavior, we'll say, the first thing we want to do is help them stop hurting.
Yeah.
And once they've done that, then we say, you know what, to make this stick, you're going to need some meaning in your life. I think that's why we see a lot of people in the addiction community gravitate to religion, especially to Christianity. I'm a Christian, but I'm not a very good one. I'm not a very good one, but I try. But it's there's a hole in the human soul that has to be filled by some kind of something. And it's going to be a meaning of some kind. And is it going to be a pursuit of truth, justice, grace, kindness, forgiveness? What is it going to be? But if we can get people to the point where they say, you know what, I need to stop hurting, then they can stop and think about later what that meaning will be to fill it. You can't get rid of dopamine and not fill that gap with something else. And I propose that we fill the dopamine gap with here and now experiences that ultimately contribute to life meaning.
Yeah. One of the kind of analogies that I like to use is if you have a plant that's not growing, and part of the reason it's not growing is it's in poor soil, it's not getting enough sunlight, and you're pouring poison on it. If you want to get the plant to grow, first you have to stop pouring poison on it. Then once you've stopped pouring the poison on it, then you move it to some healthy soil and give it sunlight and water. But, if you just keep pouring poison, it doesn't matter if you put it in healthy soil, you do have to give it time to recover from that poison. Not to say that these things are poison, but, just that kind of like, if you keep staying stuck in that dopaminergic activity, it's going to be very hard to recover.
Yeah, that's right. Dopamine promises us that the next thing that we go chasing after, on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, dopamine promises that the next thing is going to make us happy. Not that it's going to just make us happy for a little while, but it's going to be the best, possibly the best thing ever. That's a lie. I compare dopamine to the guy standing out front of a comedy club down in the Village in Manhattan. And he's standing out there and he's going, hey, we got comics in the show here. We got comedians. These are the guys you see on late night TV. Come on in. It's going to be the best show you ever saw. Come on in, see the show. The guy standing out front he doesn't even know who's on the show. He's never seen their act. He's just promising you it's going to be good. And once he got you inside, it's not his problem anymore. That is dopamine. Dopamine saying, hey, this next thing you're chasing, it's going to be the best ever. And when you get it, you're going to be so happy. And once you succumb, once you go get that thing, dopamine shuts off like a faucet. It's done. You want to feel this for real? Even if you're familiar with the addiction feeling, think about when you go to make a big purchase. Okay, make a big purchase in a store, and you're getting that new that new iPhone. You got the new iPhone here, so you're going there and you're carrying it up to the register. Stop for a moment at the register and think how good it feels at that moment. Oh boy, when I get this, I'm going to have the new iPhone. It's going to do everything. And as soon as you give them your money and they put it in a bag and hand it back to you, that feeling starts doing like this. And when you get it home and open it, click, it's over. And every new exploration of the iPhone diminishes that dopamine feeling because there's less and less new to know. This is why relationships get boring. And why porn doesn't get boring, because as you pointed out, porn is the ultimate driving machine, because it's like, oh, you don't like this? How about 2? How about 3? How about this? How about this set? On and on and on it goes. Infinite variety. So it's such a sticky, difficult problem to deal with. But it will respond to the same things other addictions respond to. And the pleasure of escape will be even greater.
Yeah. And it's got some unique characteristics there, these things that are called the 3 A's of porn addiction. It's what makes porn so highly addictive. It's that the 3 A's are the accessibility. So it's highly accessible. You can grab it out of your pocket whenever you want to. It's affordable. So it's free. The more affordable a drug is, the more addictive it's going to be. If a drug is $10,000 a hit, it's not going to be very addictive. But if it's free, there's no barrier to it. And then it's also anonymous. And so you can do it without anybody knowing. There's, you can hide it very well. And because of these 3 A's of porn addiction, it's such a sticky substance. Like you say, on top of the fact that there's that infinite variety. I mean, it never, if you wanted to, it can never be stale. You can always find something more extreme or different.
If
Yeah, go for it.
if I may, in my book, I talk about the first and second great decouplings, and it's in the chapter about sex, or about pornography. Very different things, sex and pornography. And the first great decoupling came with the introduction of the birth control pill, because it's hard for anybody who's under the age of 80 basically to quite conceive of this, pardon the pun, but the notion of disconnecting sex from the risk of reproduction was essentially a first in history. Oh, well, there were condoms, there were barrier methods. Yes, but they all required some preparation and planning between stimulation and action. The birth control pill said, you want in, you're in, boom, you're out. That's it. That decoupled the idea of, if we have sex, there may be a risk of a baby. That's the first decoupling. The second great decoupling, and this is the thing that's been even more powerful and influential, gets to the 3 A's that you're talking about, is the rise first of the first element was the appearance of the videotape machine. At that point, you could go in, you could rent pornography and bring it home. So that got rid of the accessibility problem you talk about. Suddenly it's accessible. You didn't have to go to some seedy place to get it. And then couple that with the rise of the internet and internet advertising paying for it, and the other 2 A's are taken care of. So online pornography represents the second great decoupling of sexual feeling, pleasant sexual feeling, sexual satisfaction, although I hesitate to use that word, sexual response from any interaction of any kind whatsoever. It's siloed, the most powerful human response. So it's even a greater decoupling of humanity than the birth control pill. And that's why it's a hinge of civilization, nothing less than a hinge of civilization.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a very powerful, and that's one of the things I like to talk about with the guys in my community, is really just understanding that sexuality is a beautiful aspect of human nature, but it's a very powerful one. And it's something that you need to learn how to be in a healthy balance with, because it can get hijacked by these multi-billion-dollar industries. The porn industry, it can really hijack these systems and take advantage of something that is naturally very beautiful, or human sexuality. It's a strong drive. I like that you brought up this concept of, when you said sexual satisfaction, and you almost paused at satisfaction, because in many ways it's unsatisfying. Like, it's sexual pleasure. It's that it feels good. And I think that's, speaking of the word decoupling, but in a different context, to decouple the concept of pleasure and satisfaction, or pleasure and real happiness. And that was a big insight for me, was realizing that pleasure is not the same as happiness. I had thought that if I just had more pleasure, if I had more sexual stimulation, more partners, more validation, more success, then I would be happy. But then realizing that it just didn't work, and that happiness was really about so many other things that we don't get taught about and that don't get promoted in our society. Or like, sex sells, but contentment and inner peace and compassion and being of service don't sell. You don't see any companies like selling that, because it just doesn't hook us the same way.
Well, I like to remind people that the reason the sex drive is so powerful is because it's a survival thing. It's a survival of the species. And think about who, let's see, this is an interesting point that was made to me by my friend Dan Lieberman. I co-wrote, you can see it there, that book, The Molecule, more the first as opposed to the second over here. As he said, not only is it a survival mechanism, but the people who succeed at it, the ones who breed and create the next generation, are the ones who are the best at it. They're the ones who are really good at getting partners. And so here we are, generation after generation, we're the kings, we're the queens, we're the best at it already. All the ones who weren't very good at it died off. So not only are we fighting biology, we're fighting the best of the best. This is a cage match among, the best. The Rowdy Roddy Piper goes against, Hulk Hogan. We're all great at this. So
yeah. I mean, there's a strong natural selection to increase that kind of libido, that lust, that desire within the species. Sexual selection. It's really powerful.
Yes.
Yeah.
You said something else about happiness, and I think this is a useful thing to know, because you're right. There is a difference between happiness and pleasure. And I always like to cite the Declaration of Independence, which says the pursuit of happiness, mentions the pursuit of happiness. And the way it is often taught and the way we often think about it is, hey, there's this crazy shout out to having fun in the founding documents. That's not what they meant. The men who wrote these were highly educated individuals. And when they spoke of the pursuit of happiness, the word happiness they borrowed from John Locke, Locke. And when John Locke talked about happiness, he did not mean, hey, let's go have a picnic. Locke, as a philosopher, referred to happiness as service, satisfaction, and meaning. The pursuit of service, satisfaction, and meaning. Now, I don't mean to damn the notion of a picnic or a roller coaster, but I'm saying that they were getting at something bigger. And that's what we need to think about when we talk about happiness. Do we want to be happy? Well, let's think about what we mean. We need to have meaning in our lives in order to make any of this stuff stick. I'll tell you, and this isn't happy news, but I'll say it. If your goal is just to get through the porn addiction and then to go to something else, it's not going to stick. Unless you find a meaning in your life to replace that with, it will eventually creep back. And it may not be the porn, it may be something else. But the idea is that we have to fill our moments where we enjoy ourselves with real pleasure as opposed to happiness in the Lockean sense. If we don't replace it, something will flood in there. And fortunately, we can say, what is it that will make us Lockean happy? And it turns out most of those things involve looking without and not within. What can I do that I'm good at, that I enjoy doing, that makes a difference for other people? I'm not talking about social justice. That may be it for you, but I'm talking about, or for anybody who's listening, I'm talking about if you're going to be the lunch lady, if you're good at working in the kitchen, you like kids, then the third one's taken care of. You're actually making a difference in people's lives. Well, who do you want to put the mashed potatoes on the tray? The grumpy lunch lady or the happy lunch lady? That's meaning enough in life right there to be the good lunch lady, to be I think I'm a pretty good writer. I think I have meaning in my life because of what I do. Am I changing the world? No, but I'm making myself and a few other people a little happier in the larger sense and a little better off. That's enough. I
think that's important. That, especially for a lot of the listeners on this show, I'm not a religious person, and a lot of the listeners of this show aren't either. And there is this misconception that when people talk about living a life of meaning or purpose, it means you have to join some religion or believe in some creator. And that's just not true. It can, as you say, be as simple as doing things, with love. Like whatever it is you're going to do, can you do it with love? Can you do it with kindness? Can you be a good person? Can you live with integrity? And that can be enough to live a life of meaning.
And I'm gonna push back a little bit on this idea of love. First, I know I haven't gotten on here and said, you need Jesus, that's what you need to do. I've never said that. I've said, for me, I'm a Christian. I'm not very good at it. I mean, I'm really, can I say shitty? I'm shitty at being a Christian. I wish I were better at it. But what I'm telling you, whatever works for you, that thing has to be not merely the concept of love, because the word is too amorphous, in my opinion. When we say love, what do we mean? I mean, there is a real bone deep satisfaction in giving something of yourself to make life better for another person, not for the showiness of it or the performative aspect of it, but, it's going to sound like a boast. I hope it, I don't mean it to be, but it's going to sound that way and I can't help it. I teach at Georgetown University. At the beginning, in fact, last night was the first night of the summer semester. And in the first 10 minutes, I say, here's my cell phone number. I write it on the board. And I say, if you have a problem and you need to talk about it and you don't want to call the university system, you call me. This phone sits by me by my bed at night. If you call me at 3 a.m., I'll pick up and I'll talk to you. If you have a problem in here tonight, we'll call off the whole damn class and you and I will go get the help you need. Nothing is more important than you getting the relief you need if you're hurting. That's the way I've chosen to try to give back. And it's happened. People did. It's not like I have to make an empty promise. People will call that number and they'll call. And I didn't say it to be showing. I say it because that's what I want to do with my life. It gives me a feeling of meaning that's better than a moment of chasing some quick hit of pleasure. That brings me true happiness. Am I joyful all the time? No, but I have meaning all the time, most of the time, even when I'm sad. And I think that's the nut of the defeat of the dopamine treadmill and the dopamine drip.
Well said. Beautifully said. I guess to kind of cap things off, because we're getting towards the end, if somebody is listening to this and they're saying, well, I'm really just stuck on dopamine, on porn, video games, all of it, what would you say is the first step? What would you advise?
Can I have two?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. First is call somebody who is sympathetic. If you're not up to calling a therapist, call a friend and say, look, I'm about to tell you something that's going to make both of us uncomfortable, but I need you to be my friend and just listen. You don't have to approve. You don't have to respond, but I need to tell somebody. That's the first thing. Chances are they're going to say, well, let's get you some help. That's the first thing. The second thing for the vast majority of people who say, I don't want to talk about this to anybody, just want to get some help, is I want to talk about something called the observing self. And let's talk about a psychological process. This is very quick. There is stimulation and there's reaction. So let's say I'm driving down the highway like I was tonight, and it starts raining really hard. And my first reaction is, I better jam on the brakes and slow down. Well, if you stretch that out, you realize that's not exactly what happened. What happened was the rain started, and then I made a snap decision, and then I acted on it. That space in between there where there's a snap decision, that doesn't have to be a snap decision. That can be a moment to think about, what am I going to do? And in that moment, you engage what we'll call the observing self. You go, oh my, it started raining. What shall I do? Shall I pull over? Shall I jam on the brakes? Shall I close my eyes? Shall I turn on the wipers? What shall I do? You have a choice every time stimulation appears as to how you will respond. And you can take possession of that time and act as the observing self. Now, maybe you'll still make the same poor decision, but at least you'll know you're making the same poor decision. And that's the beginning of progress. Say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do this thing with the pornography, and that's what I'm going to do. Well, now you're aware. Now you're aware. And the next time you can think about it again. What do I choose to do? Last time it didn't make me happy. Maybe I'll try something else. And that's where the book comes in. It says, here are some things to do to prepare for the moment, to have ready in the moment, to do in the moment, to do after the moment. There are things we can do besides be disciplined. And that's the observing self.
Yeah, it reminds me of that famous quote that's attributed to Viktor Frankl, although it's actually Stephen Covey, but that quote, between stimulus and response. Have you heard that quote? Yeah.
Yes.
But so for those who haven't heard it, it's between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is your power to choose your response. And in your response lies your growth and your freedom. And that's exactly, it's so much of addiction, and this dopamine trap is really hooked on, you're on this autopilot. It's this compulsive, there's very little space between that stimulus and the reaction. But if you can gain access to that space, as you say, then you can fire up the observing self and ask yourself, what is actually going to make me happy? What is going to bring me a sense of meaning and fulfillment? And it's so important to be able to access that space. I like also the first tip you mentioned of find someone who will understand and who won't judge. And so much of addiction recovery is sharing what feels shameful or what you're embarrassed about in a safe space. Like when you can share that in a safe space, so much of the shame melts away and starts to die. So I would definitely echo that as being one of the early steps. I think one of the other things that you mentioned that really resonated with me is just asking that question, what is going to make me happy? Like, that is such an important question that so few of us actually do. We just assume that, oh, what society tells me is going to make me happy will make me happy. Buying the fancy car, getting more money, getting the attractive girl. But actually to pause and ask that question, has this worked? Will this actually, in my experience, has getting these things made me any happier? And if no, then okay, well, what has made me happy? And as you say, it's like, oh, being of service, helping and supporting others. There's so many things. I think so many people would benefit from asking themselves that question. What will actually bring me happiness?
And that brings me to something else, if you don't mind if I add one other
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
When when I talk to my students, one of the first things when we talk about things like persuasion, for instance, I teach a lot of writing classes and how to think and how to communicate. And I say, because I'm pretty honest with them too, and I say, very few of you have any real opinions. You think you do, but you don't. You've adopted opinions. You've adopted the opinion of somebody that you think knows, but you haven't figured much out from first principles. And there's a whole lot in our own lives, like you just said, what would really make me happy? You say, oh, well, I'm sure a life of service will make me happy. Well, you don't know that. Somebody told you that and it sounded good. Why the hell would a life of service make you happy? I think it will, but that's for you to figure out. Why should that make you happy? Don't adopt opinions anymore. Figure them out. And if you don't know, one of the most shocking things that I ever heard from my son, he was 10 years old, and we were talking about whatever was on the news that night, driving around in the car. And I said, well, what do you think about topic A? And this 10-year-old boy turned to me and he said, Daddy, I don't know. I haven't thought about it enough. I was shocked. I was proud and shocked. And that's what I think can make our lives so much better is somebody says, well, what do you think about that? And I go, I don't have a clue, Jeremy. I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. I could just mouth what I heard somebody say on television, but I'm not going to do that. I don't know. Own your life. Damn it. Take possession of this thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's making me think of one of the things that's very important in the recovery group that I run is just the foundation of a mindfulness practice, having some form of self-awareness practice. And the reason for that is what you're talking about, which is being able to tune into your own experience and see for yourself the effect that different habits and behaviors have. Like, oh, okay, if I'm being really mindful and self-aware and tuning into my experience when I'm watching porn, is it actually something that brings me happiness or joy or fulfills me? Because if you're not paying attention, you won't know. You'll just follow that dopamine trail and the craving. But if you're really paying attention, you can start to see like, oh, this actually doesn't make me feel good.
Right.
And if you're paying attention and doing something, you can start to notice what actually does work for you, which might be being of service or being a painter and being a creative, whatever it is. But you have to figure that out for yourself, as you say.
Yes. Yeah. Try, fail, try, fail, try, fail. You're going to fail. All right. You're doing better than you were. That's a pretty good outcome.
Yeah. Because you're aware, at least. Yeah. Well, final question for you. Do you have any last words for the listeners? Anything that we didn't touch on today that you'd like to leave with the listeners?
Yeah. You don't have to hurt. A little bit of effort every day, a little bit of effort that's purposeful and planned will make a difference in your life in every area. If porn is your problem, that's why you're listening to this. A little bit of purposeful effort. Put it on your calendar. Spend 5 minutes today thinking about how I might do something about this, what I might do better. And at the end of 7 days, you spent 35 minutes thinking about it. And the end of a month, you spent 2 hours thinking about it. That's more than you were doing before. Little bits add up. If you're hurting and you want to change, start small. Any improvement is better. I've studied French every day for 9 years, Jeremy. I don't speak it very well. I don't understand it very well, but I know more than you do. And it's pretty good feeling. It's a pretty good feeling, and everything in your life can be surmounted. Make your life better by approaching it a bit at a time.
Mm, great words. All right. Well, it's been a joy having you on the podcast, Michael. Thanks for coming on, and thank you for staying up so late to do this episode. It
Time
really,
for bed.
yeah. Let's let you get off to bed then. So that's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Unhooked. We will catch you all on the next episode.